It's an honor and pleasure to introduce the man that really doesn't need an introduction in Alberta and literally not in Canada. Rick George is a giant in the Canadian business world, not just the resource business world. Over 2 decades as president and CEO of Suncor, he oversaw its transformation into one of Canada's largest integrated energy companies, valued at over $50 billion. Among numerous accolades, he was named Outstanding CEO of the Year in 1999, received the Canadian Business Leader Award in the year 2000, and was appointed as an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2007. In addition to his corporate achievements, Rick chaired Calgary's Committee to End Homelessness in 2007, and since retiring from Suncor, Rick is now a partner at Novo Investment Group. As keynote speaker today, Rick will tell us about the importance of growing global companies, and who better than this icon of the Canadian energy industry to speak on it. Please welcome Mr. Rick George.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ron, and thanks for being such a great supporter of mine and of the book, and for buying a book for everyone here. It's very kind of you. I have to tell you, about 3 months ago, I was given this a great award by the Ivey Business School in Toronto. It was a black tie evening, and someone did a very gracious introduction like that. And my wife was sitting right next to me, right in the middle of a very long introduction. She leans over to me and says, "You know, Rick, you're not that good." Okay, so anyway, you always have all sides to your life. So, you know, by the way, just to make it very clear, the name of the book is Sunrise, okay? This is S-U-N, not S-O-N. This is not a book about Justin Trudeau. Okay, so let me start with I'll get you on my side yet, don't worry. So let me start with a question: why write a book? And as I was working late in the evenings on drafts number 13, number 14, and number 15, I asked myself that very question many times. The answer really partly rests with my passion for this industry and for Canada. And as I prepared to leave Suncor, I thought it's important to write about what I see as a great Canadian success story. You know, often in Canada and in the US, we see lots of press around business challenges, stories about Nortel, which was in the paper today, difficulties at RIM, some less than stellar results we've seen in our own oil and gas industry here in Alberta. But you know what? This country and our industry is full of some great successes. So, listen, this is a book about what I see as a Canadian success story. It's about Suncor, it's about the industry, but more importantly, it's also about people, about leadership at every level, not just the corner office. It's about overcoming challenges and, importantly, changes in technology. Now, it also does spend some time on what I refer to as the environmental file. It also talks about how we reach decisions around producing, transporting, and the use of energy. And I'm going to briefly talk about these items before I go on into some of my views about how my experience over the past 20 years might relate to our current challenges and the development of our great Canadian resources. So this book is part of that picture. And not surprisingly, it's a story told in first person. But the way that I really want readers to think about it, it's a story about really hardworking people who made real change happen in our industry. If I were to describe me in this journey in a few words, I would say I'm a hopeless optimist. I don't tend to see the glass either half empty or half full. I always tend to see it completely full. Now, I recognize that a hopeless optimist is a contradiction in terms, kind of like having a championship Maple Leaf squad or a New York Jets playoff team, right? I thought about doing an Oilers joke there, but you may be too sensitive, okay? And we're just starting out the season. You may do better than Calgary, so I decided to stick with some other metaphors here. But listen, whether it's a sports franchise, a community or charitable initiative, a government policy or a business strategy, I really believe that when pragmatism meets optimism, when passion meets patience, and constructive dialogue meets well-considered actions, anything is possible. So just to read from the first line of my book, In early 1991, I stood on a platform just north of Fort McMurray, Alberta, and I surveyed what I suspected would mark the end of my career. We didn't capture that occasion with a photo, but if you wanted an impression, Edward Munch's The Scream would be pretty close. What I was looking at was the oil sands. It was an industry that had been launched 24 years earlier by an American, Sun Oil's J. Howard Pugh, the very personification of optimism and contrarianism. He saw the potential for this huge resource, larger than any known in the Middle East at that time, to provide energy security and economic growth for a continent. Based on sheer numbers, some 1.6 trillion barrels of oil in place, the theory was sound. But the practical reality on the ground was extremely challenging. The initial technology to recover oil sands was literally made up by the industry's pioneers, borrowing what they could from then current mining technologies or forging fixes on the spot. All of that done in a very remote location, and I know you know about the weather extremes. So for the first 25-year history of Suncor's oil sands operation, it was obviously not promising. And the operation for virtually that entire 25-year period struggled to even break even on costs in the face of those many challenges. You know, when I first arrived at Suncor, the joke went about our plant up north says, listen, if it wasn't frozen, it was only because it was on fire. And there's a lot of truth to both of that, by the way. So, listen, I don't want to go into all the calamities, both inside the company and outside from government policy, but what I would say about the result, that Suncor's history and struggle and failure had become part of the company culture. There was really little optimism. And without optimism, there was little room for contrarianism, that kind of outside-the-box thinking about how to turn the corner. Challenging and changing that mindset is one of the biggest challenges, and I would say one of my proudest accomplishments in those early days. Starting with experts, we did have a combination of global consultants, company management, veteran frontline workers who were probably the most important part of that. We developed a vision with a strong belief that change could be made. In short, we needed to get past arguing about degrees of how empty the glass was to a mindset of how full it could be. And that's a topic I want to return to when we talk about some of our current challenges. Pushing our way towards success involved harnessing two powerful elements, and those are as true today as they were 20 years ago, and that is the elements of imagination and technology, which together, in my mind, means innovation. Now, there were some major leaps and many small steps on that journey of innovation for Suncor, but as an example, and probably the most iconic, was this shift in our mining operations. We made a $120 million investment, and it was the hardest $120 million I ever got out of a board of directors ever. In fact, I got billions out of them later on that became much easier than that first $120 million. But it was a huge bet at the time to change our mining system from a very outdated bucket wheel mining system to truck and shovel. That move alone reduced our operating costs by $5 a barrel, got our return on capital above our cost of capital for the first time ever, and the result was we ended up with a real business with cash and earnings margin. That meant that we could attract new capital and make even bigger bets, all really great fun stuff. And while we're on that subject of change in technology and making a difference in those early days, I want to point out that change has always been an important part of this industry. Just look at the last 10 years alone. The technology has made an amazing difference in our industry. You only have to think about the difference that horizontal drilling and fracking have made on the conventional side of production. And in oil sands, perhaps the best example is SAGD technology, which went from almost no production 10 years ago to today, where we're facing production rates of 1 million barrels a day. That's all happened in a relatively short time. And you know, as proud and as excited as I am about those last 10 or 20 years, I actually think the next decade or two are going to be even more exciting, particularly on this continued development from new technologies of these great resources of ours. There goes that optimism, full glass thing again. You know, the world-class resources we have in Canada will enable us to continue to grow as an industry, continue to develop and apply new technologies at even a faster pace, continue to provide opportunities for our young people, and continue to improve our environmental performance. And I do mean continue because we have one of the best track records of environmental improvement of any industry in this country. That leads me to the part of the book that deals with the environment. First, let me say I'm proud of the accomplishments of the industry. In the last decade, we've seen great improvements in the industry's track record, significant improvements in land reclamation, in SO2 emissions, in using less energy, in reducing CO2 emissions on a per barrel basis, in water use, and in recycling. Again, most of that change driven by technology. And I know there are a lot of critics out there who don't like intensity measurements, but just take one case in point, and that is, for example, on water use and recycling. As an industry, we started making improvements on a water intensity basis, on a per barrel basis. That curve of reduced intensity eventually flattened out and turned into absolute total water reduction use. That's how continuous improvement works. Now, I could go on citing statistics for you, but it's probably best for you to either arm yourself with data from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers website, or better yet, just read my book. You know, the book is written, hopefully gives an even-handed review of these significant improvements. I also discussed some of my interactions with environmental groups, politicians. Doug, you're not in there, I'm sorry. But it did get a great review in the Financial Post when I took some of my shots at some of the hypocrisy around Hollywood types who fly in to tell Canadians how to get things done and then fly back to California on their private jets. There has been some press around that particular section of the book that has been indicating maybe I was too hard on them. I can tell for sure that many in this crowd today will say I was way too weak. Trying to make everybody happy is usually not a great objective because you end up focusing on who gets a sip from the half-full glass, but I'll come back to that more in a moment. Maybe that's a good point to jump off or speak in a moment about Canada's role in the global nature of energy business and specifically the markets. So let's begin with one hard economic fact. Energy is the largest industry in Canada and is certain to grow to be even more so. The energy sector makes more money, employs more people, and generates a wider impact on Canada's trade balance than any other business. You know, in this great country of ours, we attract a lot of tourists, we manufacture lots of things, but when it comes to pure economic power, few things compare with energy. And the biggest part of that energy equation, of course, is oil. The Canadian petroleum industry depends on oil exports to employ people and enrich this country generally. Yet almost today, 100% of our oil exports goes to one spot, the United States, primarily in the US Midwest. And obviously extending the reach of the Gulf of Mexico with the Keystone XL pipeline, and I do believe it will be approved, is a good thing. But is it enough? Most trade relationships, and I would say all successful ones, are interdependent, with each side benefiting to a similar degree. Where our oil exports are concerned, however, Canada depends almost wholly on the United States. But the reverse is not true. The United States does not depend on Canada for its supply. It has several sources for the oil it imports, albeit most of it, if not all of it, from sources with poor records of environmental performance, worker safety, or human rights. But the supply is there nonetheless. It's not a balanced situation, nor a healthy one for Canada. Either directly or subtly, Canada is vulnerable to US pressure where pricing and other aspects of selling our products and our energy is concerned. The solution is to create access to markets other than the United States, and the most promising of those, in terms of if you think about growth, is Asia. We need to move this oil in this great province of ours from a landlocked position to the Pacific coast. And we need a pipeline to do it. Without an alternate export market, Canada could suffer a dramatic blow to its economy and its standard of living. The US, at least in an energy political arena, has proved to be an unreliable partner. And it is my belief that the average Canadian citizen is more than well aware of that. Revenues from this industry are measured in the tens of billions of dollars pouring into provincial and federal coffers every year. The Canadian Energy Research Institute estimates that the oil sands industry alone, this isn't conventional, this is just the oil sands industry, We'll pay government revenues of more than $775 billion in taxes and royalties between 2010 and 2035. If that income vanishes or is vastly reduced, as we see today with these differentials, federal and provincial governments will have to either cut services or raise taxes substantially. My concern about relying on the U.S. as our sole customer for oil also extends beyond those economic impacts. It also reflects my identity as a Canadian nationalist. It's actually about our basic sovereignty. And it's also totally unnecessary. Trust me, Alberta and Canada's environmental policy and enforcement are far more stringent than those in Texas or in Illinois. Do we really need members of the U.S. Congress telling us how to run our energy sector? If either Gateway or Trans Mountain expansions are completed, it will influence the many aspects of that Canadian-American relationship back in our favor. We won't have to be nearly as concerned about American views of our policies, and our voice will be heard more loudly and more clearly. Now, I do appreciate the concerns of environmentalists expressed around pipelines, and it's a very important, but I also know the standards that have been set for the proposed new pipelines. That includes transporting and loading technologies and techniques that have been proven safe for 30 years without incident in similar terminals in the North Sea, in Sweden, in Scotland, in Norway. My view is we're dealing with relatively low risk. To do with these risks, we're best served by a combination of sound science and strong regulation. These elements need to be complemented with a civil discussion about how to fill that glass of opportunity, not in partisan politics, not in that NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and also not with concerns over public funded raising publicity. Listen, we are Canadians. We can do this. We're in the driver's seat. But what we can't do is keep kicking decisions down the road only to be surprised at every turn. For various reasons, including Canadian governments working their own self-interest and the market working today full-time to arbitrate these differentials, I'll give you one prediction. I actually believe the differentials will narrow over the next 12 to 18 months. We'll have to wait and see whether that prediction comes true. So looking at the current challenges facing our industry here in Alberta, I would list 5 major challenges. First of all, these light, heavy, and WTI Brent differentials, which I just discussed, which is really a matter of infrastructure. Environmental concerns would be number 2. Number 3 is labor availability. Number 4 is capital and operating costs. And inflation generally, which is part of the 4 prior points. These challenges, many of you might say, are very different than the challenges the industry faced over the past 20 years. I would say, yes, some of them are new, but these challenges are no more daunting than those faced by this industry over the past 2 decades. Each of these challenges have been addressed by industry and by government. We've already discussed the differentials and environmental improvements, but just to make a couple of points on the other challenges I mentioned on labor, we have multiple parties, including a lot of people in this city, that are working on educations, on skills training, on immigration policies that encourage people to come to this country with the needed skill sets. Most importantly, involvement of Aboriginal peoples in the industry, which is extremely important, and which we have a good track record of improvement. There's still much to be done. And the last resort, of course, is the use of temporary foreign workers. On capital costs, there does seem to be a more disciplined approach than the experience we had in 2005 and to 2008 boom cycle. We're even starting to see a few SAGD projects come in close to budgets, which is a great sign. There is room for optimism on these challenges. In addition to those, and perhaps most importantly, the best way to approach these challenges, and the challenges in your own business, would be to rely on the application of the 2 things I mentioned before: new technologies and imagination. We need to look far down the road to our energy future. We need that vision, that pragmatism meeting optimism, corner offices meeting boots on the ground, passion meeting patience, and a constructive dialogue meeting well-considered actions. So just to conclude and to shamelessly plug my book, let me go back to the first sentence in that book. In early 1991, I stood on a platform just north of Fort McMurray, Alberta, and surveyed what I suspected would mark the end of my career. It didn't turn out that way. With a blend of perseverance, hard work, optimism, a dose of contrarianism, and more than an occasional stroke of just plain luck, all supported by thousands of tremendous people, we succeeded. In doing so, we built a company. We went from $1 to $50 billion valued company. We built an industry, and we built a pillar of the Canadian economy. Now, I believe that's a story that's very repeatable across this industry or other industries, whether you're a conventional or an unconventional operator or a service company. As an investor myself, I'm convinced that companies with great leadership, with great assets, and great strategies are going to do very, very well over the next decade. Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know if you want to
Rick, on behalf of everyone here, and everybody has lived the Suncor story somewhere in their balance sheets or their income statements probably over the last 25, 30 years. I'd like to thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
You're a builder of the Alberta economy, you're a writer of a book, and on behalf of everyone here, we'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation to hopefully keep you writing over time.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you.